welcome to the latest webinar in our Engineerica Education Keynote Series. We are very pleased to be bringing you this complimentary presentation, and we are very happy to see you all here today. So for those of you who are new to us, Engineerica specializes in academic center management systems for higher education. You might be familiar with some of our software applications such as AccuTrack, Accudemia, and AccuCampus. And of course, I want to give a special welcome to any Engineerica clients joining us today. And for those of you who are not yet clients, I do want to let you know we are offering a complimentary fall trial of our most popular center management system, Accudemia. This gives you the opportunity to use Accudemia for an entire semester risk-free to see if it helps make the management of your center and data collection easier. So if you are interested, you can send me an email at rachelc@engineerica.com. That's RACHELC@ENGINEERICA.com. So we started this keynote series for our clients and contacts who want to learn more about best practices and trends in higher education. Each month we feature a distinguished speaker to talk about hot topics in the academic support field, and we will make an announcement through email and social media when registration opens for our next keynote webinar, so do be on the lookout for that. A quick introduction to myself. I'm Rachel Cook. I'm a client success manager with Engineerica. I was previously a learning center manager for 6 years, so like you all, I am very passionate about higher education and student success. I also have with me Nick Armstrong, one of our technical support specialists, who's here as my backup, and also to help with any technical issues that might come up on our end or the speaker's end or yours. I am pleased to introduce you to this month's speaker. Dr. Rick Breich serves as the Senior Director of the Landmark College Institute for Research and Training. Landmark College exclusively serves neurodivergent students, such as those with ADHD, autism, or learning disabilities. His work centers on the study of executive function, including understanding disparities in executive function and testing the efficacy of interventions, programs, and strategies aimed at enhancing EF. So without further ado, Rick, I'm going to make you the presenter and have you take it away.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Engineerica, for having me. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. Give me 1 second to set up my screen. Well, again, yeah, thank you for the warm welcome, Rachel. Again, thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. I'm very happy to present to all of you today. Thank you again for Engineerica for asking me to be here. Again, my name is Rick Breich. Nice job, Rachel, in pronouncing that correctly. It's a fun fact. My first and last names do not rhyme, even though it kind of looks like they do. Again, the Senior Director of the Landmark College Institute for Research and Training. Rachel kind of mentioned our specialty at Landmark College. I'll say a bit more about that as we go. But today I'm going to be talking to you all about working memory, a term I'm guessing a lot of folks out there have heard about, probably know a little bit about, but also want to clarify. Sometimes there's some misconceptions about what working memory is and isn't. And then most importantly, we'll of course dig into an overview of some strategies, some tips, some approaches to supporting, or as we say here, scaffolding working memory in your work with students. So without further ado, let's just jump in. We always like to, standard practice here at Landmark College, present an agenda. Ideally, I would have this in another window up the whole time during the presentation. Quite figured that technology out yet, but if you're in a classroom, if you're in a session, even a session with a student, definitely recommend this. So tip number one, using an agenda. We'll talk a little bit about why that's useful. It's small, but it can be a small but powerful little tip to just scaffolding working memory, basically reducing some of that load for having students wonder what's coming up next, right? Or remembering the sequence of operations. So we already kind of are into the introduction here. Next, we're going to dive in and make sure we're on the same page about understanding what working memory is and what it isn't. We'll have a short demo of working memory, and we'll have a quick quiz on working memory as well. I may say WM sometimes, short for working memory, just FYI. We're going to talk about the related concept of cognitive load, which is really just describing how we fill working memory and the implications for learning. And we're going to talk to you about, hopefully I'm going to convince you working memory is integral to the learning process. And then again, we're going to talk about really just sort of an overview of some strategies for supporting working memory. And then I do want to leave some time at the end to get questions from all of you and hopefully provide some adequate answers for you. So real quick, again, just want to mention again, I come from Landmark College. We're a small school in southern Vermont. As Rachel was mentioning, we exclusively serve students with learning differences or neurodivergent students. So in particular, students with ADHD, autism, and learning disabilities like dyslexia or dyscalculia, and of course, all the comorbidities and combinations therein. We're a relatively young school. We've been around about 35-ish years. And as such, we've developed, as you might imagine, we're sort of a high touch school. So there's a lot of support, kind of 360 support around the college for supporting students. These are bright individuals, college able students, but have often struggled with these learning differences in traditional settings. So we employ things like universal design for learning. We also talk a lot about executive function. While our students are all unique, often if there's a commonality, it's challenges, difficulties with executive function. In particular, I'm part of our small but strong Institute for Research and Training. And we really do just what the name says. We do research into understanding learning and learning differences. And then we disseminate best practices in the field through things like webinars or professional development trainings. We have a certificate program for educators where it's all about learning differences and neurodiversity and incorporates things like executive function, universal design, and other best practices. And so it's this nice collaboration of research to practice. So just wanted to set the stage a little bit where I'm coming from. Again, my background is in cognitive psychology and studying executive function, but moving that really from the lab to applications. How can we take our understanding of the brain and of cognition and use that to help support things like executive function, things like working memory, which is part of executive function as we'll learn. Okay, so without further ado, let's jump in and get to this definition of working memory. So by working memory, we're talking about those cognitive processes needed to hold information long enough to process and act on. Right? It's really holding on to the here and now. It's kind of just our current focus of attention. So it's not what you had for breakfast, or even if maybe you're on the East Coast, what you just had for lunch, right? It's a very short time span. That memory is almost a misnomer, right? So it's very, very short duration. We're talking ranging anywhere from maybe fractions of seconds to a few seconds is how long an items might be held in working memory, unless you're doing something like rehearsal, which is another good strategy, actually. In other words, something like talking to yourself, that inner voice is a good way to rehearse items if they're verbal in nature in working memory. If there's any sort of computer people out there, you can kind of think about it as the analogy of the RAM memory in your computer, right? It's kind of that workhorse. It's doing all of that important calculations and processing, but again, in sort of that online kind of space. I think to further sort of explicate what we mean by working memory, I always like to do this short demo. Some of you may have seen this before, or heard this before. It's called the digit span. It's a classic kind of neuropsych test of working memory. And when we say test of working memory, what we're really, as researchers and practitioners, often interested in is the sort of capacity of working memory, like how many items individuals can hold at one time. It's a classic way it's been examined anyway. So I know we're not, I can't hear you, but I'd like everybody to just please, if you can, do this out loud with me, this little demo, if you're able. And I realize not everybody might be able to, so say it to yourself if you're not. But what I'm going to do is simply I'm going to start. I'm going to say a sequence of digits to you. I'm going to pause. I'll do kind of a hand motion here, and then I want you to repeat those back to me or to yourself, and then we'll do that a couple times. Okay, sound good? So here's the first one: 6, 8, 5. Hopefully you said 6, 8, 5 back out loud. Okay, good job. Here's the next one: 5, 0, 3, 6. Hopefully you said 5, 0, 3, 6 back. Now on this next one, I want you to do that last one, but backwards. So hopefully you were able to just go 6305. And then just one more to kind of torture you, 49081. Say it back, 49081. All right, I'll stop there. If I was being cruel, I would continue going on and increasing the number of digits, right? And basically how that's done, in a testing situation is you do that a few times, basically until the individual hits capacity, right? Until they can't do any more sort of correctly, or at least two incorrect trials in a row. And again, that's just a classic test of the number of sort of items you can hold in working memory. Now, it's that storage of information, but it's also that what you do with that information. So as talked about in the literature, that's that storage and that manipulation. So when I had that example of doing it backwards, that is a sort of a manipulation, right? You had to do something with the memory, not just hold it in memory. So you had to hold it in memory and then think about how to say it backwards. So that's just a very simple, brief sort of explanation of what working memory looks like. To put this in context a little bit too, I've already alluded to this, but I did just want to mention that working memory is often considered one of the building blocks of executive function. By this very famous model by a researcher Mayaki and his colleague Friedman, they've sort of through some complicated statistical factor analysis determined that there's three really core components of executive function. Executive function, I'm guessing a lot of folks have heard about, but I'll give a quick definition. It's an umbrella term for cognitive processes that regulate, control, organize, and manage other cognitive processes. And it shows up kind of everywhere these days. And it's related to a host of other behaviors, such as self-regulation, emotional control, and it's sort of dysfunctions of executive function or challenges in executive function sort of pop up in a host of areas too, such as clinical conditions like ADHD, autism, schizophrenia. There's research saying executive function is differentially impacted, say, by youth living in poverty, et cetera, et cetera. So executive function, it's rightly so, has been kind of this buzzword in education, and not just education, but it's made its way to education and talking about, again, students that are bright, articulate, but might struggle with those all important things like turning work in, work completion, organization, time management, all these other hosts of sort of important things that go beyond just the pure learning of content, right? Anyway, back to working memory. Working memory is considered, again, one of these core building blocks of executive function, along with inhibition or inhibitory control, and also cognitive flexibility, which is the ability to think symbolically, but also to switch back and forth kind of efficiently between different tasks and different goals. And one of the main points here is that these three are sort of separable. We can think about them individually, but they're also highly related. They work with one another to form sort of those more real world executive functions that I was mentioning, like time management or organization or planning. So working memory, executive function, I might be using those a little bit interchangeably as we go, but just wanted to put this again sort of into context. So why else, why are we talking about working memory? Well, for one thing, there's been a host now, decades worth of research linking working memory, again, capacity, the number of items you might be able to hold, to a whole host of sort of important life outcomes, things like general cognitive ability, things like language and academic aptitude, reasoning, planning, and a whole host more of sort of important things, right? But I want to get to this next point here, is that the processing capacity, of working memory is quite limited, right? That number of things we can hold in mind at one time is actually pretty small. And at this point, I want to do a quick poll with all of you and have you sort of, I want to quiz you on what you think this number is, right? So what do we think the average working memory capacity is? So let's see. Oh, thank you, Rachel.
I just launching
that. Great. So what do you think this average capacity is? How many items can one hold at a given time on average? I'll give everyone just a minute to think about that and put an answer in it.
Okay.
Look at that. Real-time reporting's coming up, I can see. Excellent.
Yeah, we've got about 70% voted so far. 76, 77. All right. Looks like it's hovering around 79%. You want to close it?
Yeah, that's fine. I think we're getting the picture here. So
Okay,
let's
and
see,
I'll
will you be able
share the
to? Yeah,
results.
perfect. Okay. Yep. Perfect. You did what I wanted. And you're not exactly wrong, most of you, but you're a little bit wrong, and let me explain. So that 7 plus or minus 2 is a really common value that's been thrown out there. Probably if you took psychology or even cognitive psychology, say in college, you learned that, and that's essentially what we once thought working memory capacity was. This sort of golden 7 plus or minus 2, just meaning that most people fell within 5 to 9 items, and it makes sense. Phone numbers without area code are seven digits, but unfortunately, newer thinking in the past decade or so, especially in terms of visual spatial working memory, it's really shown that number is really something like 3 to 4 items. So sort of in one fell swoop, I've just lowered everybody's working memory capacity out there. Don't want to go into too much of a tangent, but why that is partly because in those old tests, like the digit span, it allows for things like rehearsal or strategy use, right? So if I gave you a list of letters, say that was FBI, CIA, right? You can chunk those and sort of use strategies, which is a good thing. But if we're trying to kind of purely measure that capacity, we're not getting that sort of scientifically valid number. So again, on average too, that's a really important point to point out. It's somewhere between 3 and 4 items. And we can argue about exactly what it is, but really just going back to this point here, it's limited, right? We have a limited capacity. Yet, as I'm starting to hopefully convince you, working memory is really critical for learning. So that's take home point 1, right? Is just we have to keep in mind this limited capacity nature of working memory, because it is this gateway to information processing and knowledge acquisition. So what do I mean by that? Let's take a task, a really important academic task that probably a lot of you work with students on, perhaps, is reading, right? But let's think back a little bit to when you were, if you can, when you were learning to read, or if you have young children like myself, or if you can remember if you have a child when they were learning to read. It's an immensely complex process, which, by the way, our brains aren't naturally sort of designed to do. Language we are, but reading not so much. Reading is a relatively new evolutionary process, right? And so if you think about the task, it requires all kinds of things that, spoiler alert, rely on working memory. So when you're doing the decoding process, which is taking the how a word looks, the orthography of the word, and match that to the sound of the word, right? That decoding process, the phoneme, the sound of the individual parts of a word, you have to hold that in memory. You also have to pull from long-term memory what those sounds are and what those letter squiggles on the paper look like. And then you have to decode the sound of later syllables or later phonemes, and then you have to put those together, recognize that that's a word, again, pull from long-term memory what the meaning of that word is, hold that in mind, hold that in working memory while you start to link that to the meaning and the phonemes of the next word, right? And all of a sudden you have a sentence. And as we get more, complex reading, we have to keep in mind the meaning of that sentence and how it relates to the next sentence and to the fuller paragraph, and how this relates to the theme the author or the arguments the author is trying to make, sort of, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And all of that, of course, relies on working memory. You're holding all of that information in mind at one time, more or less. Now, what happens is we do a lot of practice with reading, right? We become very fluent readers. And some of these things start to happen automatically, right? For you know, with the exception of individuals, say with learning disabilities, with let's say dyslexia, they will always have some difficulty, right, with that decoding process. But setting that aside for a moment, this starts to happen automatically, and then we become very fluent readers, right? And we often kind of read words without even thinking about it anymore because we get so practiced at it. But that process of learning was heavily dependent on working memory. And that's really the case for learning any new material. It's all going through working memory, right? Same holds for math, for example. Classic examples, if you're doing division, you have to hold the borrowed quantities in mind while you start to do the next calculation, or keeping track of the sequence, the order of operations, et cetera, all kinds of things in math. Same with writing, you have to keep in mind the topic, the audience, your thesis, generating ideas, all of that's happening kind of in working memory. So I know that was a bit of a jump there, but I just want to kind of really emphasize that the working memory is this central gateway to information processing, i.e. learning. Okay. And then two, just bringing up this point, as you become fluent again, I mentioned this, but you become more automatic, and we can kind of contrast things that are automatic, things that are well practiced, things that become habits of mind, versus things that need, in cognitive psychology, we say controlled processes, but you can think of those as those executive function processes, right? And anytime that it's controlled executive function, there's a heavy demand on working memory, and it's limited. You know, think of it as your fuel tank, and we'll get to that metaphor a bit more in a moment, but it's limited, right? And how you fill that up becomes really critical. Okay. So just want to point out, it doesn't become too hard then to sort of extend this into thinking about, well, what challenges with working memory might we see sort of in academic settings, right? You know, we call these breakdowns. Where do sort of these challenges kind of appear? Sure, you see these in a lot of students you work with, but difficulty remembering directions, difficulty remembering the sequence of idea, even in more sort of somewhat social situations, right? Difficulty in group conversation, keeping track of who was speaking, whose idea was whose, or even an individual conversation. And of course, really just anytime you have to hold one bit of information while doing something else, or something with that information. And then again, as already kind of mentioned, this pops up quite a bit in our core academic tasks like reading, writing, and arithmetic. Okay. So I was just alluding to this, but this idea of cognitive load becomes really important. And this really just describes how we're filling working memory. Again, limited space, but really critical. So, and what those implications for learning are. Okay, so first of all, we can think about, we can think about, again, this maybe, well, let's use the metaphor of a fuel tank, right? So we have this space of working memory. We're just going to represent it here physically, spatially, and we can talk about different ways we fill up that space. So we can talk about intrinsic loads, and those are really the core elements of a learning task, right? So if it's a critical thinking essay is the learning objective, you know, I'd argue that analytic thinking is really the key component there, right? Or we can contrast that with, say, an algebraic word problem. Really the intrinsic part there, if we sort of strip everything else away, is algebraic reasoning, right? That's our objective as an educator. Those are if we really break it down, that's the learning objective of that task. And then we can just flip that with kind of extraneous load. So those are parts of a learning task that are not integral to the learning goal. So I would argue in our two examples, spelling in a critical thinking essay is something that would be an extraneous load. And reading, right, doing that decoding that we were talking about in an algebra word problem would be extraneous if we're really trying to teach algebraic thinking. But as you might be seeing where this is going, learning is efficient when cognitive load doesn't exceed that capacity. So we think of the larger blue area as the capacity, and we have our extraneous and intrinsic together. Those need to be, you know, fit in that bucket, fit in that fuel tank for learning to be efficient, right? And that means when we can keep extraneous loads low excuse me, we might not ever be able to completely eliminate some extraneous components, but we can certainly do some things to minimize extraneous. And then conversely, we can meet students where they are, right? Our intrinsic loads appropriate to the learner's ability level. And then, of course, learning is slowed or stopped when cognitive load exceeds this capacity. So when intrinsic loads are beyond their ability, and or when extraneous loads are high. Okay, so again, a little bit kind of throwing a lot at you, but I want to do a quick simulation that I hope will sort of drive this point home. And so again, this requires some active participation on your part. If you can grab just a scrap piece of paper, and hopefully you have one nearby in this digital world that we live in. Hopefully you still have some paper around you can grab, and also a pen or pencil. And it does need to be a pen or pencil, not your keyboard. So give folks a moment to hopefully grab those. I'm going to give you other instructions here, but do not start yet. What I want you to do is just maybe jot down a few things you've learned so far today, or maybe even that reminded you, validate some things that you already knew. But here's the twist. I want you to write that with your non-dominant hand. So if you're right-handed, write that with your left hand, and if you're left-handed, write that with your right hand. And I will give you just 2 minutes to do that, starting now. Okay. So what I'd love to is via is it the question box, Rachel, again, to just get some reactions to that. Yep. Type in, what was that like? How did you feel doing this task with your non-dominant hand? Just kind of your general reflection and reaction to that simulation.
Amr says torture.
Yes, right.
Slow and tedious. Felt silly. Like I'm using a different brain. I hated it, thanks. Slow, very difficult, awkward, hard to remember which way the letters go.
This is perfect, all. Thank you. I apologize for the bit of torture, but I had to prove a point here. And yeah, thank you. Feel free to keep them coming, but I'll just sort of comment quickly on a few of these. Yeah, it was, it was difficult. It got harder as I went. I was too focused on how my writing looked. Maybe too, I'm not sure if I'm seeing this here, but maybe when I cut the time short, that was a little intentional, right? I added a little pressure. Right, and so hopefully what a lot of you are saying here is that, yes, obviously it's hard to do the mechanics, that motor skill of writing with your offhand, but what a lot of folks are saying, what I'm getting is that it also had this sort of emotional effect, right? And it also started to cloud your thinking, right? For some of you, it wasn't just about the writing. It started to make you got either nervous or frustrated that you also started maybe couldn't come up with the ideas, or maybe not as quickly or as efficiently as you thought you had, right? So someone said couldn't remember what I'd learned. It was fun. Someone said, okay, great. I'm glad to hear that. But right. So the point here is that right, it was this additional load. It was this extraneous thing that you had to process, which means, using that metaphor again, that took up maybe a lot of, or maybe all of your available sort of working memory space, just trying to think hard and concentrate, focus on the mechanics of the writing. And then there was very little, if anything, left over to actually pull from long-term memory what we learned, or to think about what you learned, or to maybe to come up with those ideas quickly and efficiently, right? So if we think back to those other examples and say you are a English as a second language learner, or an individual with dyslexia, and you're first presented with an algebra problem and it's in one of these sort of torturous, train A leaves Chicago at 3 p.m. and train B leaves New York at 1 p.m. traveling, it's all this language, and you're spending a lot of your available working memory space, your learning mechanism, right, just processing the language. Well, there's very little or anything left over to do the task at hand, which is to think about the algebra involved, right, as an example. Okay, so hopefully, don't want to belabor this, but hopefully I'm convincing you that working memory is critical, and even more critical is how we sort of fill that space. So we can think about a lot of other factors, right, that limit this available working memory, right? We were talking about averages, but we know there's natural variation just because there is, right? Some individuals maybe have a lower working memory to begin with, or this attention is obviously highly related, or general executive function. Again, language deficits, and deficits maybe isn't the right word here, but language differences, right? If you have trouble decoding words, or if it's in a different a non-native language, a lot of that processing is going to be taken up by just processing the language. Or again, if we're not meeting you where you're at, right? So if you're starting out with algebra and they haven't learned the sort of prerequisite skills necessary for that, it's never going to go well, obviously, right? And then another big one, which of course we're all seeing more and more on our college campuses, is anxiety or other affective issues, right? If you're ruminating on a fight you had with your roommate right before class, right? That's taking up your working memory space and your attentional load, obviously, and it can be very difficult, obviously, to focus in class. Okay, so let's just pause here for a second. We're going to switch gears now. Hopefully, again, I've kind of convinced you of this importance of cognitive load and what we do to fill cognitive load. And so with that in mind, thinking about what we talked about with automaticity versus controlled processes, and this idea of cognitive load, we're going to start to dive into some of these techniques to support working memory. I'm guessing some of these are going to look familiar to folks, but hopefully making this connection too with why they're so important and why they might support working memory will help sort of additionally validate using those tools, or maybe some of them will be new as well. Okay. So first of all, what we can do is we can really, this first slide, I should say, is really just a kind of a broad stroke overview of things we can do. So we want to obviously try to reduce extraneous cognitive load as much as possible to free up working memory. So I know this isn't quite grade appropriate generally, but again, back to this idea of algebra, right? You obviously don't start out with this complicated word problem. You probably don't even start out with typical sort of X, Y variables. You might start out with sort of manipulatives or visual representation, right? Concrete representation. So showing, say, the number of oranges in this box and this other empty box over here, and looking just to kind of how you would determine how many oranges you need in this box to make them equal, right? That's algebraic thinking, but it's done in a very concrete, very sort of physical form, and that's the first way to represent it, and then get increasingly sort of more abstract, right? Certainly, we can address confidence and other affective issues, right? Growth mindset, obvious one here that's really important. But we know so much about how critical beliefs and self-efficacy are for these things. So definitely, I know a lot of folks are familiar with growth mindset, but we're big believers, and we've done our own studies here on growth mindset, and really that's one key step, because if you don't have that confidence, you can't, it's hard to then engage in any kind of academic material. And then we can talk again about sort of effective strategy use and scaffolding these processes. So here's just a quick example from the literature in cognitive load. Ways to reduce, this is an example of ways to reduce extraneous load. I apologize, I know this image is a little, it's not the highest resolution, I apologize, but a lot going on here. But the point is that we've got sort of two versions of a geometry problem right here. And in the first example on the left, really the problem itself and all the necessary information to solve that problem is down below, right? They have to kind of read this information below, whereas on the right side, the angles, right, and the steps are integrated within the problem. And that might seem very sort of it might not seem that critical, right? But even just having to switch your attention from two places is known as the split attention effect, right? So you have to kind of go switch your attention back and forth, and there's a certain cost, there's a certain load associated with that. So if your goal is really just teaching the geometry, you're just making it unnecessarily difficult while not getting at the core sort of learning objective. That's again really the whole point with extraneous load. Some people wonder about rigor and such, but again, if you think hard about any given learning objective, any given learning task, and think hard about what am I trying to teach here, your goal should also be, let's clear the hurdles, let's clear the barriers that aren't important to that part of the learning, and focus on that. And then yes, through practice, again, becoming more automatic, becoming more habit, you can start to up the complexity a little bit. So another great tip that we talk a lot about here at Landmark is routines. And I'm guessing some folks do some of these maybe without even really thinking about it. But let me just stop and ask a second, ask you for a moment, you know, why would routines be useful for executive function? Just think about it to yourself for a moment. But basically the answer again is it's increasing the automaticity, right? It decreases that need for executive function, effortful control. It's reducing some of that extraneous load. As I was at the very beginning, I was talking about agenda is a great example of this. A lot of students, a lot of individuals in any kind of setting, especially if it's sort of a new or unusual setting, and even if it's not conscious, they might be thinking a little bit about what are we going to do next? What's this session going to be like? What does this even mean to be in a learning center, right? So any ways you can just through this doing the same things every time, you can reduce some of that anxiety, some of that rumination, right? And just again reduce some of that cognitive load. So lots of examples of these, but you can have, these are sort of both in class or in sort of learning center sessions, but there might be a certain way you start class by you always write down the assignment, or there's a certain way you format assignments all the time, a certain way you organize notebooks, material, certain way you prepare students for tests and projects. All right, you can bring in maybe a mindfulness or a quick like meditation exercise or breathing exercise to start every session. I know a lot of folks are doing that now, and that can be a great way. It doesn't have to be long, it can be a couple minutes, but just something to sort of ground, set the stage, and also it's just that routine. Then you come in and go, oh yeah, I know what to do now. I know what's going to happen from here on out. Or a certain way you might answer questions, sort of, et cetera, and et cetera. The list goes on. So I think in the interest of time, you can think about this, but are there routines you already use when working with students, especially in learning center academic support situations, right? Are there standard ways even students sign up for sessions, or standard ways that you start a session or end a session? And if not, if you're not already doing these, I bet a lot of you are, but could you implement some simple routines? So something to think about. But we'll move on just in the interest of time. But yeah, just something you might want to think about is how you can increase routines. The next one we have here is all about clear directions. And this is another one that might seem overly obvious, right? And but I will say we often sort of overestimate how clear our own directions are, especially to young adults, right? Developing brains. As we also know, executive function is still coming online at this typical college age, right? It's coming online as I'm sure many of you heard, into your mid-20s is the current thinking. So here's just one kind of fun demo that illustrates this. So in this image, I want you to find the hidden tiger. There's a hidden tiger in this image. So take a moment and see if you can find the hidden tiger. Okay, so if you haven't found it already, and again, this is just sort of a fun example, but to me, the instructions were very, very clear, right? Find the hidden tiger. Most of you probably, the first thing you thought of is it's an actual physical kind of tiger somewhere hidden, maybe in the reeds or the bamboo here. But if you look closely, the words, the hidden tiger, are written in the stripes of the tiger. So again, just a fun example, but just really pointing out, being very explicit in how we give directions, again, can be really useful to reduce load, just because there's not this additional processing that needs to happen, thinking about interpreting what does it mean to find the hidden tiger, or what does it mean to write a 5-page paper, or whatever, again, whatever it might be, but just being super clear and explicit with our directions we give students. And the other really important component here, thinking back to working memory load, is not too many, right? So think back to that 3 to 4 items. So it should be simple steps, especially if you're giving those verbally, and it's anything more than like a simple 1-step direction or instruction. Then you should also write it down. You should also have it in your digital LMS, et cetera, on the agenda, or somewhere they can see it as well. And give some wait time as well. We know that folks also differ in their processing speed, which is kind of related to working memory, but separate, right? And then reverbalize those as needed as well. Okay. Oops. So yeah, and just another fun example here, illustrated in the cartoon. The teacher saying he wanted to summarize the book, and she made things summary instead with the sunglasses, etc. So it's another silly example, but other sort of examples of doing this. Oh, actually, I want to stop here and just say that it's not just me saying this. There has been evidence from research kind of looking at clarity, right, in terms of how you organize instruction, how you explain content, provide examples, how you guide practice. And in the literature world, they've shown from meta-analysis, if you don't know, that's just a study of studies. It's kind of looking at a bunch of studies together, and they showed a 0.75 effect size, which again is just that's a medium to high effect size when we look at like educational research between clarity of communication and sort of student achievement. So student achievement being things like grades and sort of performance in classes. So yeah, there's research behind this too. It's not just us saying it, right? Here's another example, just to try to make this a little bit more explicit and clear, right? So especially with reading tasks, I'm sure a lot of you work with students on this and sort of active reading strategies, right? But just sort of formalizing that here, you can tell students to read an article or a paper or a book. So read the article, or you can tell them what to read and why they're reading it, right? So read this article in order to why. And then sort of gold star version is tell students what to read, why they're reading, and how to engage with the reading, right? And so just again, to make that a little bit more explicit, you might say something like, read this article, the really big one, because we want to understand why the Pacific Coast should be preparing for a massive earthquake, and list the historical evidence about the last major earthquake in that region. So just an example of a really being explicit with our goals and tasks with students. Okay, just kind of flying through some of these strategies because I do want to leave time here at the end for questions. But another one that I'm sure folks have heard about, but again, bringing it back to working memory, right? And this goes sort of with executive function in general, especially those students that might procrastinate, that might have a hard time initiating. We talk a lot about activating here at Landmark, right? You can have these conversations with students and they have really they can be very eloquent and have and articulate and think about a topic and sort of know the information, and then their output, right, doesn't match. It doesn't match maybe that level of expertise when it comes to the sort of product, whether it's a paper or project, right? And so something like the Pomodoro technique can really help break down a task, especially things like papers. You can take this to, I'll just say before I describe it, you can take it to and sort of modify it for a lot of different purposes. This general idea being we sometimes call it here like micro uniting, right? Just breaking the task down into its constituent parts. And this is, by the way, often really useful for all of us in any kind of big project we might have. A lot of us, myself included, right, you tend to procrastinate those big projects as it can seem overwhelming, right? And so this can just help us get moving, get the ball rolling. It's just a sort of template for doing that is the Pomodoro technique. So if you haven't heard about this before, it's pretty straightforward. You decide on the task, you set a timer. Here it says 20 to 25 minutes. I think it's fine if you want to bring that down a little bit, 10, 15 minutes even. And then the goal is you work on that given task, right? You focus on that task for that amount of time and that amount of time only until the timer rings. After the timer ends, you maybe have a little physical reward or sort of notation that of completion of that. You put a check mark on a piece of paper, and then you take a short break, maybe just a 3-minute break, and then you repeat for another, say, 20 minutes. And then usually after, say, 4 of those, you get rewarded with a little bit longer break. So maybe now you take a half-hour break. And then if you're up for it, sort of rinse and repeat. And again, what this does is just sort of scaffold that process of breaking steps down, just breaking down that attention. We know, again, from the cognitive and learning literature, just in general, short, concentrated kind of bursts of focus and work with breaks is always going to sort of beat out those long drawn out times of when you're working on something, right? And that comes too from research on sort of learning skills and strategies like athletic skills, right? All the best athletes follow this kind of format, right? You work really hard, especially on something that's maybe at the edge of your ability, right? So this idea of zone or proximal development comes up, right? That thing that's like a challenge, but also manageable. Like you can probably get there, right? So that's the best kind of stuff to do, best kind of problems or tasks to work on, and also in this just regimented way. And for some students, especially those with executive function challenges, this can be really, really useful for them to get going, to get activated, and to get that work completion in. So there's all kinds of examples out there, by the way, and there's of course apps, digital apps, and other websites now that will help you do this as well. So there's one referenced here, tomatotimers.com. Fun fact, some of you might know, but the name comes from the guy that sort of invented this method. It was Italian. Pomodoro in Italian is tomato. I guess when he was using this first using this, he was using an old sort of kitchen timer that was shaped like a tomato, hence Pomodoro technique. Okay. And then in general, I mean, this is just again sort of a general strategy tip for thinking about scaffolding working memory, right? Use external aids whenever possible. Don't try and rely only on your working memory, especially for the other stuff that isn't intrinsic, right, to the task at hand. So obviously, use agendas, schedules. Big tip here is just go with what works for the student. I happen to love digital schedules and agendas like a lot of us do now. You can have it on your phone, your computer, but for some, it's really that process of sitting down and creating their color coordinated schedule, and that's part of the process for them, and that's what works for them. So certainly go with that if that works for them. Similarly, sometimes a phone can just be a distraction, as we know, for a lot of us and for a lot of our students. So sometimes it's better to get that paper and pencil. But the point being is you're going to have to work with the students to sort of see what works best for them. It's also known, students with, say, ADHD, but I think in general too, sometimes just this time awareness, it can be a challenge and a skill that's sort of learned, right? So often, and that goes, of course, along with like how long a task is going to take, right? And so just having that physical representation, more of the old school either sand timer or actual clock that moves around, and having that out there, say while you're doing the Pomodoro, is another little trick that can help sort of just understand how long something takes and how long they should be spending on a given task. I mentioned UDL earlier. If you're not familiar, that's Universal Design for Learning. Definitely check out CAS.org if you haven't heard of that. Won't go into depth here, but really the idea is that presenting information in multiple modalities, right? Historically, we've taught mostly through, largely through text and through reading. And as we've certainly understand that that's not always going to be the best modality for some individuals. And so anytime you can introduce additional modalities, especially visual, graphical, especially things like mind maps or graphical organizers, is a great way to help also just sort of scaffold memory in general. We also know in terms of long-term memory, if you can have different ways to point to that information, so say a text and an image that represents an idea or thought, something known as the dual encoding theory, right? There's going to be kind of 2 pointers now to that memory when you have to recall it later on a test, for example. So just encouraging whenever is appropriate, and again, when certain students are going to take to it more than others, definitely encourage the use of those. And then just goes without saying, there's no shame in writing it down, right? And getting help with writing it down. And so there's a lot of tech tools out there, note-taking tools that can really assist with this, especially in things like lecture situations. So a lot of you are probably familiar, but there's this great piece of software, Glean, and there's a link there that can assist with that. It basically records the audio lecture, and it has a lot of other nice key features, including things like during the lecture, a student can they can take notes, but they also don't have to, because they can lessen that working memory demand and that stress of having to take notes and pay attention during class, because they know it's going to be recorded. But there's other features, like if there's something that feels really important and or they just want to kind of go back to or didn't quite get during it, by a press of a button, it's going to mark that in Glean, and then you can go back later to that specific kind of timestamp and review that information. And there's other great tools in there where it's sort of they encourage use of making elaborative notes, which we of course are much better than just sort of rote note taking, right? You take notes and then you go back, review, and you elaborate on them, which is again a time tested way to retain information in the long term. Here's just my kind of rough example of one way you can use a graphic organizer, say to take notes or to practice information, right? So this is like understanding a protein structure. Point being here is one tip, just whether it's text notes or graphic like this, kind of the best way to do that is you don't want to obviously give completely blank notes with nothing there, and you also don't want to fill in everything. You want to go somewhere in between, right? So there's some of that information there. That scaffolds, again, that working memory, sort of, again, lessens that stress of having to know everything, but also then hopefully engages them to have to sort of fill in the blanks. So I know we're running out of time here, but just a really quick summary of tips for supporting working memory. Write it down, use multiple modalities, mind maps, diagrams, create visuals. We can try and automate as much as possible, right? Things like routines, but we can think about this in other ways too, right? Just automatic versus controlled. As much as we can offload all that extraneous stuff and really leave room over for that intrinsic component of a learning task objective is the way to go. And again, one way to do that is through micro-unitting, breaking down steps, keeping instructions clear and concise, visual and verbal. And that about concludes the presentation today. I do want to just quickly say a bit of a plug here. I mentioned at the beginning, we also provide professional development training. So if you found any of this useful, you want to learn more about learning differences in neurodiversity or executive function or universal design for learning, and many more topics, we have a number of options that we provide through Landmark College and through our institute. One of which being is a graduate level certificate program for educators You can take 5 courses to get a certificate, or individual courses in a whole host of topics like academic supports, executive function supports, self-regulation, motivation, lots of great stuff. And we can also come to your school organization to do professional development. There's webinars. There's also free stuff. If you check out our webpage, we've got a newsletter where we give tips out for working with students, neurodivergent students. But again, a lot of these tip strategies are going to work especially well for neurodivergent students, but are going to tend to work well kind of for all students. So appreciate your focused attention and taxing your working memory today. Thank you so much for joining. Again, if you're at all, I encourage you to check out our newsletter. There's a link and a QR code there. Again, we have infographics too on executive function and neurodiversity. So again, thank you so much for your time. I'd love if you have questions, get those in now, or Rachel, if any of them come in, we can certainly address some of those. Okay.
Yeah, we do have a few. So for those of you who are sticking around, so Jessica asks, when someone has disorders that make establishing patterns or routines difficult for them, how do we implement those routines since they could be so helpful?
If disorders of routines, I'm not really aware of those. Maybe she's just suggesting things like ADHD have issues with routines.
Disorders that make establishing patterns or routines.
Yeah, I mean, well, it can be difficult, but yeah, just practice. I mean, and bringing in a little bit sometimes too that engagement, that metacognitive piece, right? That's another one we didn't get to, but this general idea of using metacognition, which is just thinking about thinking, right? That self-awareness. So that's often the first step, right? As we work with students and do some self-assessment of things like strengths and weaknesses, especially as it relates to things like executive function or those related, important components like time management, organization, etc. And just using that language, right? Students may or may not have heard some of this, and then B, may not really know what that means. Even if they have a diagnosis too, they often don't always necessarily really know that much about how, really know the details of what that means or how that might affect them. So bringing awareness to is the first step, which might be, my point being, awareness of difficulty with routines, and then explaining like the importance of routines, and then digging in to try and practice some of those, right? So definitely engage. Too often we throw strategies at students. You might say, like, I've heard students here say, yeah, I've heard, like, yeah, use the Pomodoro. Okay, what does that mean, right? Like, you need to, it is it can be a resource, high resource kind of commitment, right? To work with students and practice, demonstrate first, right? Show them how to do that. It can be a process, but one that often pays off in the end, right? So that's kind of a long-winded question, but that it is kind of working with the students, finding what that angle that's going to work, bringing attention to it, bringing awareness to it, and then deliberate practice with it, right? Again, those short concentrated bursts tend to work better. And giving the rationale. Student, we all want to know, why is this important for me? So just being upfront about why you think it's going to be important can help too. Then lastly, these are all tools for a tool belt, right? I mean, there's no magic bullet. It's going to take some trial and error to find the ones that work for individuals.
All right, and Amr asks, can you briefly speak to multitasking in relation to working memory? Is multitasking ever good or acceptable in terms of maximizing it?
Great question. I love to. My dissertation was essentially on multitasking. So yeah, the take-home message is you want to avoid it. It is bad mostly. It's especially if you're talking about two things that think back to working memory and cognitive load. If you're thinking about two things that really are going to be that are cognitively effortful, right? So that doesn't mean you can't, jog and think about, or, well, hopefully you're not thinking about work, but maybe if you're, you know what I mean? You can do something cognitively demanding with something physical or motor, because that's going to be like a completely different system. But anytime you're truly multitasking, what you're doing is you're sort of rapidly switching back and forth between these two different goals or these two different tasks, And even though that can seem very fluid and can seem very efficient, study upon study upon study show that that's going to induce a cost, right? In terms of it's going to take you longer every time you have to switch, and you're going to be more prone to errors every time you have to switch. So any given time, that might be in the order of milliseconds, but by some estimates through the course of the day, if you're doing heavy multitasking, by some sort of estimations, can be up to like a 40% reduction in your efficiency. Whole bunch of stuff on this too, but there's been studies done where they take people and they ask them if they think they're good multitaskers or not, or if they use a lot of different media, and then they basically split them into low or high, and they ask them to do these high cognitively demanding tasks, actually like a working memory task, and you get the exact opposite effect. So those that said they were the good multitaskers actually perform worse on that task than others, as another example. So for the most part, you definitely want to avoid multitasking. Now, it relates to this idea I mentioned of cognitive flexibility, which is an important executive function and is critical to things like thinking symbolically, whether that be in math or learning a foreign language. And so that is an important component, but it's a bit of this double-edged sword. You want to sort of use that carefully and sparingly when you want to really engage flexible thinking, but sort of pure multitasking in general is to be avoided. And you can reference those studies to students who tell you, no, I'm a good multitasker.
Great. And Amr also asks, should the focus be on one particular task per Pomodoro, or can one just do work during the Pomodoro, which can be miscellaneous tasks?
That's a great question. I'm going to hedge a little bit and say I think it depends on the individual, but typically how it's sort of presented is it's a bigger task, and here's sort of the subtasks that you want to accomplish. So that's one way to approach it, at least. So, and that was kind of what I was alluding to, is you're both micro-uniting and using this kind of template to do it, right? But there's no hard and fast rules either. So if it works better to just kind of get work done, but you have to have any given instance, it has to be a fairly clear goal of like, what do I want to accomplish in this next 20 minutes, I'd say. I've also heard, this is a bit more anecdotal, but really sticking to that, even if you're in the zone and then timer goes off, it's good to stop, take a break, get that. Again, you can kind of think of working memory as this battery, right? And so that you're draining it, and then it needs time to recharge, right? And so that's partly perhaps why breaks are so important.
And then Kristen wants to know, what was the website mentioned in regards to multiple modalities?
Oh, yeah, Universal Design for Learning, CAST, CAST.org. So really the Universal Design for Learning in a nutshell is instead of, nothing wrong with accommodations, but instead of, it's building things from the beginning to reach the widest range, teaching to the edges, reaching the widest range from the beginning. So purposeful design of curriculum and assessments and ways to engage learners through multiple means, right? So not presenting information just in text only, right? Thinking about different ways to engage learners, and we're sort of blessed now with a lot of digital tools to help with this, right? But engaging students in multiple modalities, and then assessing students on multiple modalities when appropriate. Again, when thinking back to the learning objective, if the objective is to demonstrate analytical thinking, does it have to be a paper? Could they do that in a poster? Could they do that in a presentation? Could you get really out there? Could they do that in a performance art piece? As long as they're meeting the rubrics and the objectives, then is it that important the modality they use to do that? That's the nutshell. There's a whole lot more in there, but it's really a mindset, right? So some people make the mistake of thinking it's like a set curriculum. It's really employing that mindset, and it's really about doing that in what some people call like a +1 manner, right? What's one thing I can do on this week with one assignment, or this semester or this year? Like, you don't have to tear it all down and start over. Just start to incorporate some of that thinking.
All right, and I think this might be the last question we have. Sanam wants to know, in regards to language ability and cognitive load, I'm wondering if translanguaging or encouraging the student to freely use any or all the language they speak could free up some working memory space. Is that something that you've seen studies on or has come up in your experience?
Oh, geez, I think you just taxed my kind of loads. A great question. I see that here. Let me take a second and just translanguaging. Are you, I think maybe Sanam's getting at speaking multiple languages. I mean, there is some evidence out there, although like a lot of things, it can go back and forth, but being bilingual, for example, has been associated with a better executive function, although there's some pushback on on that literature as well.
He does clarify, so not limiting the students to only using English in class.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I don't know. I guess that the short answer is I'm not sure of research on that, but my guess would be that, well, A, they would have to be very fluent at it, right? So they would have to be, I would say, completely proficient in both languages, right? Because again, that's multitasking, right? Switching back and forth between languages, if that's the question. Yeah, so I guess I'd be cautious about it, but if it becomes really natural and it's really automatic, then it might work.
And I know you mentioned having to leave at about 10 past the hour. It looks like we do have one more question.
Sure, I can take one more question. Absolutely.
Okay. All right. Liz asks, when do these supports get in the way of higher order processing? Is there a point at which structure gets in the way?
Great question. There probably is. It gets a little bit back to, this is a bit of a cheat, but it gets back to sort of the objective, right? Or what do you need to do, whether it's in the classroom or in your career, in your workspace, right? So yeah, I mean, it might at some point, and this is, I guess what I can talk about, this is a bit of a debate in the executive function literature too, right? So is it better to kind of train these core executive functions like working memory, but as people might know, things like, here I'm talking about like brain training, right? Programs like Lumosity, right? As you may know, there's been a bit of backlash there because a lot of the evidence suggests what you're doing is you're really kind of teaching to the test almost, right? It doesn't have as much transfer as people think. It seems like the evidence is suggesting it's pretty hard to change these core abilities. So a lot of our approach, again, is the scaffolding idea, or you can think of it too as like reciprocal systems or compensatory. I don't want to say compensatory is not a great word, but that is the language from things like brain rehabilitation, where someone actually has damage to a particular part of the brain, and essentially a lot of times they can learn to do the same thing, but they're employing sort of broader networks of the brain or different areas of the brain. Or the same thing happens, there's evidence in aging, right? You tend to slow down a little bit, unfortunately, as we all know, cognitively, but we tend to get better with strategies and start to kind of get the same place, but a different way than maybe we used to. So it's hard to say without a specific example, but I think there could be ways the structure gets in the way. It sort of depends again on what, if the structure, if the task or the environment, the context says you can't use them, then obviously I'd say it does get in the way. But I'd again think hard about, is that really, is that limitation really necessary or really getting you something? Like, think back to the learning objective, right? Like, is it necessary that let's say, this isn't a great example, but it's coming to mind anyway. I think it is important to memorize the multiplication table, right? But at the same time, nowadays, like, we have it at our fingertips, right? So I'm not suggesting it's not important to memorize that. That's just an example I can think of right now, right? So it's like certain things might come across as like a rigor, or that's the way we used to do it, so you have to do it that way. I guess I'm just, think hard about, well, what's really critical? What's the learning objective? Does it matter if they're using a structure or support to get there or not? Not sure if that's answering your question, Liz, but hopefully that was provided some clarity.
All right. Well, I think that's all the questions we have time for today, and I don't think I see any more in there anyway, but if anyone, Liz says thanks, it's a big question. So if anybody does have any questions, you can reach out to me at rachelc@engineerica.com, and I can pass that on to our speaker. I want to thank you, Dr. Bragg, for being so generous with your time today,
Of course.
and for such a great presentation. For those of you still with us, just a reminder, as you leave, you are going to be asked to fill out a survey. We really appreciate your feedback there. And we really appreciate your coming today, and we hope that you have a great rest of your week.
Thank you all. Thanks for your time.
Bye.